Hello, Thursday, World Economic News, and we'll start with Ed Harrison credit write-downs and a chart. Interesting chart. 1950 to 1980, United States real income growth. Now, there are two bars on this chart for median and average. Median and average. Real income growth, 1950 to 1980. Median is where you've got a number series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the median number's 5 because it's in the middle. But average can be affected by, if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 20, then the average then goes up to about, well, it'll be past 6 or something like that. So why I say it that way is because that kind of represents how the rich people at the rich end are the equivalent of the 20. Now, you could imagine it being 30 or 40, but that makes the average go up, but not the median so much. Anyway, back to the chart. Between 1950 and 1980, we get a real income growth of 120% median, 119% average. So effectively the same. Real income growth 1950, 1980, 120%. Okay. 1980 to 2010, same criteria used. The median increase has been 11%. The average has been 28% because we know the rich have got richer, and when they're put in, that factors up the average. So the average is 28%, but that is nothing compared to the average of 119% that it was 50 to 1980, and the median increase 1980 to 2010 at 11% increase obviously is of no comparison to 1950 to 1980. This is not, don't try and, you can, but don't, this is not to say, look, you're being screwed, you poor working class or middle class people. This is to say, from 1980 to 2010, the whole of the United States is doing badly for 30 years. Take it personally, but I'm looking at it down on the United States and going, the 1980-2010 years were crap compared to the 1950-1980 years. Something is going terribly wrong. Okay. Credit write-downs, same. Ed Harrison, it's a different article, but he says in this article, what are the unifying themes about America today? And there are 5 that he's put in this article. 1, the financial service sector is too large relative to the size of the economy. 2, government is a large part of the problem. In fact, it is the government's desire to counteract cyclical downturns which not only has allowed debt to accumulate, but has also taught industry to insinuate itself into Washington to benefit from these actions. In other words, when there's a downturn in the economy, everybody knows that the government comes in and spends big, and they know that they have to be there to grab all that money off the table when the government does spend big. 3, deregulation as practiced now favors incumbent organizations at the expense of entrants. Large companies at the expense of smaller companies, and corporations at the expense of individuals. The Federal Reserve is part of the problem, or even the main troublemaker, through its asymmetric easy money policy geared to goosing aggregate demand after financial bubbles. Again, when there's trouble, the Fed comes in and makes money too easy to get hold of. US economic policy is short-sighted and has no discernible long-term objective that can boost long-term economic growth. That's number 5. It sounds all very logical and sensible to me. Moving on to the Huffington Post. I don't quote much, but this article from Josh Silver called Comcastrophe, the saying that Comcast-NBC merger has been approved, and he has a go similar to what Edward Harrison did in credit write-downs. President Obama is being squeezed by corrupt Washington that is run by industry lobbyists, fake grassroots groups, massive political spending and PR machines that make the most basic public interest protection impossible to advance. But rather than tell that story, dig in and fight like a true leader would, Obama has chosen to hire corporate-friendly advisors, compromise on the most crucial substance, and attempt to eke out weak, symbolic half-victories wrapped in flowery oratory and spin. Whoops. CNN Money gives us a snap of Things not quite going right. Camden, New Jersey, to lose nearly half its cops. Struggling to close a $26.5 million budget gap, the city with the second highest crime rate in the nation is laying off 163 police officers. That's nearly 44% of the force. And Camden will also lose 60 of its 215 firefighters. Sorry, Camden. Business Insider, America 1960 versus 2010. In his latest letter, famed investor Jeremy Grantham despairs that America has forgotten the warnings of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, this is one of these clicky presentation things of 30 slides of sorted data, and I've picked out a few. This was the first one, and this is America 1960 versus 2010. Foreign aid spending. In 1960, foreign aid spending was 0.5% of GDP. Now in 2010, it's 1/5 of 1% of GDP. So obviously, charity begins at home, hey, United States. Spending a lot less on foreign aid. Hey, why should you? I mean, the biggest, most powerful, richest nation on earth. Yep. America's 1960-2010 healthcare spending. 1960 was 5.2% of GDP. It is now 16% of GDP. Problem. Government spending, 1.2% of GDP in 1960, 7.4% now. Oil imports, 1.8 million barrels a day. 1.8 million barrels a day in 1960. 2010, 11.8 million barrels a day. Okay, that's the end of that. New York Times opinion pages. Eric Morris has an article entitled Peak Travel, ? With a chart of vehicle miles travelled. It's a famous enough chart. It goes back to 1910, and the really only huge dip is for the Second World War, which we can understand. There have been shocks along the way as the oil shocks came in, but it looks as though it's curving right over, and this recession has been the biggest pullback in vehicle miles travelled since the Second World War's dip. He starts the article, "Call me a skeptic about the peak oil story. Human ingenuity has always found ways to produce more of, find substitutes for, or discover ways to do without scarce resources when price signals tell us to. But if peak oil is true, doesn't one good peak deserve another? Why not meet peak oil head on with its dreaded natural enemy, peak travel?" And it's like a Superman thing, kryptonite. And this is the magic thing that would kill any peak oil anyway. We'll just do peak travel. I wonder if he's got a passport. I wonder if he even surfs further west than California. Does he not know that there is a world out there that is selling cars, buying cars, putting fuel in them and driving all over the place? He thinks just Americans driving less is going to do something about peak oil, which is a world thing, not an American thing. Out into the world, leave America. El Mundo, Google Translate. The Bolsa Santander resists failure, disabling as banker Alfredo Sainz. No, of course it doesn't make sense, but what we've got is, as advances, anyway, I'll tell you what it is. This chap has been disqualified from banking. And in the end of the article it says Santander, who he works for, hadn't heard of the High Court ruling. No, wouldn't take any notice of that. Anyway, moving on to Financial Times Alphaville and the mechanics of the Irish euro printing. This story that I talked of yesterday, that's been coming up since the weekend from the Irish Independent paper, and it is interesting, and you can read about the mechanics of the Irish euro printing in the Financial Times. Follow the link on the website. Again, FT, do more with less, EFSF Part 1. This is the Euro Bailout Fund, the EFSF, and it's doing more with less. Starting off with a quote from Jan Kees de Jager, Dutch Finance Minister, Jager. There was definitely yesterday a discussion about increasing the EFSF to more than 440 billion euros, so increasing the total to 750 billion euros. But the Eurogroup has yesterday rejected that idea. Okay. FT Alphaville again, doing more with less, EFSF Part 2. Part 2. What's left if we're not going to get a full-blooded expansion of the Eurozone's sovereign bailout fund? Not a lot, it looks to us. A ragbag of rejigged credit enhancements, lower loan rates, possibly a small program of buying up distressed sovereign debt. Other than that, we're stumped. But it goes on in quite a detailed article to list what could be in those possibilities of rejigging credit enhancements, lowering the loan rates, and a program of buying up distressed sovereign debt. The options that the European leaders have, which are not much. FT Alphaville, record-breaking, forecast-busting UK inflation, and gives us the chart for CPI inflation at 3.7% and RPI inflation at 4.8%. RPI having those silly things in like energy and food. Finish with the Telegraph. Headline: World needs 100 trillion more credit, says World Economic Forum. The world's expected economic growth will have to be supported by an extra $100 trillion in credit over the next decade, according to the World Economic Forum. Has a picture of the world, and under it says, the global credit stock has already doubled in recent years, from 57 trillion to 109 trillion between 2000 and 2009. So in the last 10 years, it's doubled from, say, 50 million to 100 trillion. So they say in the next 10 years it's got to double from 100 trillion to 200 trillion, and then presumably next 10 years from 200 trillion to 400 trillion. Based on what? Do they know what they're doing? Yeah. Bye.